This is in response to an article by Thomas Edsall in the New York Times on May 6, 2015, Sex, Drugs, and Poverty in Red and Blue America. It's a pretty long headline. I don't know if I can quite do it now. This was a little over a week ago, but now that Baltimore is out of the headlines, it might be a very good thing that we need to keep track of, which is something that I'm acutely aware of in terms of the fact that there are poor people all over the United States. There's a tremendous amount of white rural poor, and that's what I think that Mr. Edsall is talking about here. So he's comparing Baltimore and Muskogee, Oklahoma, a city of about 40,000 people, maybe 40-50 miles southeast of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he starts out his thing by talking about how if you if you put an inquiry into the Muskogee, whatever paper it is, you're going to get 213 hits or in reference to drug arrests. They have 9 drug treatment centers in Muskogee. And that as the latest statistics have borne out in terms of children who are born out of wedlock from 2013 in Muskogee, 2/3 of the children born in Muskogee are out of wedlock. Fully 50% of them from Muskogee are white. It doesn't break it down in any other way. It then goes on. He then goes on to talk about what the birth rate is on a national average. Now, for Oklahoma in general, it's 47 out of 1,000. For Muskogee, it's 59 out of 1,000, with the national average being about 30 out of 1,000. So Muskogee itself is almost double what the national average is. So then you have to remember, from the other scale, there are a lot of other areas in the United States where the birth rate for teenage mothers is under 20, under 15, something like that. So that's a very high astronomical amount. Of course, the question is why. And before we get into that, he wants to just go into the fact that, in the riots that happened in Baltimore, there were a tremendous amount of right-wing pundits that said some very mean and vile things about the poor citizens of Baltimore in terms of welfare, in terms of not having two-parent households, about it being in a Democratic fold for so long, that it's all the result of left-wing liberalism and all of the terrible, non-godly types of things that go on all of there. So, what we see, though, is that this is not a red and white issue. This is a national issue. That the problems that face Muskogee in terms of teenage pregnancy and drug addiction are just as high, or if not higher, than they are in the city of Baltimore. And that all of these right-wing pundits that are easily going after Baltimore because it's black, but they're not saying anything about rural America in general, where they have a tremendously high of white teenage pregnancy rate. They have a tremendous amount of problems with drug addiction. Remember, the drug of choice in rural America, I believe, is methamphetamines, where they would say that in the inner cities it's heroin. So I think they call methamphetamine crank. And of course, now, the right wing in Muskogee would say, oh, well, if we had traditional marriage, if traditional marriage was working, then we would have less teenage pregnancy and all of that. And then he quotes some other guy, and this is where I sort of disagree with Mr. Edsall, is that, the traditional marriage has gone down starting in the 1960s when people started to shack up. There wasn't as much of a stigmatism. But then he goes on to point out, and this is what's very, very important about this, is that this has been a national trend, both in white and in black America, that even right now, the increase in percentage of white teenage pregnancy rates is growing much faster than the black teenage pregnancy rate, even though the black teenage pregnancy rate is still above. And you can't just say that this is in reference to poverty, because the poverty rate in Baltimore is approximately 23.8%. But in Muskogee, it's 27.7%, whereas the national average is 15.4%. Now, I'd like to talk about what he said. What is the reason for all this? Now, you can blame the not traditional marriage, but I'm going to say that it's the reason there's not any good jobs in either of those two locations. Now, remember in Baltimore that in 1950 or so, Bethlehem Steel was probably the largest employer. By the mid-70s, Bethlehem was starting to scale back, and that fully 1/3 of the jobs at Bethlehem Steel, I believe they had over 25,000 people employed at Bethlehem Steel at one time, were black, were unionized, so that there were good jobs for union people and black people in inner city Baltimore. And those jobs started to leave in the early to mid-70s. By the time 1990 rolled around, Bethlehem Steel didn't even exist anymore. And it wasn't just Bethlehem Steel. There were other steel companies there, and there were a whole host of peripheral companies that were supplying them and doing all types of other types of manufacturing thing, which has pretty much died. But, and you cannot blame, a Democratic government for that in the city of Baltimore when all of those jobs were going over to China, going to Korea, going to all kinds of other places, and we were allowing imported steel to come in at a much lower cost than what domestic steel cost, whereas they were ruining the environment. They weren't paying anybody any type of good wages or whatever. And of course, in the rural areas, the manufacturing base from the Rust Belt, that stuff was all going overseas too, and that started in the 70s also. So the example would have been in the Rust Belt. If you were white and you graduated from school, let's say the same time I did, or Billy O'Reilly did, or in the mid 60s to the mid 70s, or maybe a little bit later, your chances, if you just had a high school education, your chances of getting a pretty good job in a manufacturing plant in the Rust Belt at that time were pretty good, where you could make pretty decent wages and have a pretty good life cycle. But all that shit started to go out in the mid to late 70s, and by the early 90s, a lot of that stuff had all been gone. And when you don't have you don't have a manufacturing base, or you don't have a good quality income for the people, then they're going to turn to that same old problem: drugs and alcohol all over the place. Now, you can blame drugs and alcohol, you can blame all kinds of other stuff, you can blame the Democratic administration, but it wasn't the Democrats' fault. Drugs and alcohol came in because there weren't good jobs, because there were shipping jobs overseas. The Democrats are trying to make that come back. They want good jobs. They want to increase the minimum wage. They want to increase taxes on the rich. They want to increase taxes on corporations who can easily absorb that type of thing. And they want to put that back into social services to increase funding. Now remember, we need to have good paying jobs that not everyone's going to go to college. So we need to have good paying jobs for plumbers, electricians, mechanics, and the whole host of stuff where we have people taking care of elderly care, that type of thing. We need paying jobs where people are going to get paid to do good quality work, and we need to pay them at a rate a living wage, so to speak. But we're not seeing that from our Republican friends. Now, getting back to the end of the thing here, the gentleman points out, Mr. Edsall, that this is a white and black thing. This is a red and blue thing. This is not something that you can distinguish by party at all. Because if you look at it that way, if it's just the denigration of the family, it's just because people are shacking up. What about all those 239 churches that are surrounding Muskogee? How come they couldn't do it? And of course, again, he also pointed out that it's in the heart of the Bible Belt. It's in the heart of the Southern Baptist Belt. In like 9 of the top 10 states in terms of teenage pregnancy rate is highest in that Southern Belt. The normal culprits: Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, etc. The only one that isn't there that's strictly in the Bible Belt would be West Virginia. But again, what's the correlation? If the Southern Baptists couldn't keep this pregnancy rate because they advocated for abstinence, maybe we should change our tune. Maybe we shouldn't be blaming people for this. We should be looking for solutions, which would be in the inner city and in rural America. Good paying jobs as best best we can all the way around. But that's not what we're seeing from our Republican friends. You know, let's blame the blacks, let's blame the poor parenting, let's blame the fact that there are terrible school systems, but if you wanted to pull yourself up, you certainly could, even though you have to go to school hungry every day. So enough of that. The Republicans need to step up. We need to have a whole new set, you know, of increased funding so that we can get the poor, rural people jobs and the inner city people jobs. That's what will help decrease excuse me, I also want to say we just need to make birth control available. But that's going to decrease the pregnancy rate and also decrease the poverty rate and also decrease the drug usage rate.